What is a failed state? A failed state is a state that are not able to control their territory. They cannot make collective decisions that affect their citizens, they can't provide reasonable public services, and they can't effectively interact with neighboring governments. They must also have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. This means that only the police or similarly designated enforcement officials are allowed and able to wield violent forces in the state. However, Syria fulfills nearly none of these requirements. Much of its territory has been lost to ISIS and rebel forces. Government's control across the country is largely non-existent, and the Syrian government has far from a monopoly on force. All of the factors are represented in the Fragile State Index. So, what does a failed state look like? A failed state sees widespread crime and corruption alongside persecution and human rights abuses. Without a functional government, the country is unable to collect taxes, and there is a huge economic decline. There is also displacement and migration. The growing threat of ISIS and other instability factors have kept the country on the brink of collapse, and many say that if peace talks officially fail, there is no plan B. Although the situation is dire, with more than a quarter million already killed in the Syrian civil war, a failed state would decimate the region entirely. So how did this all begin? What caused Syria to fall apart and collapse into a civil war? Here's what I'm going to talk to you about for the next 10 minutes. There seems to be one person to be blamed for the significant decline of the Middle Eastern country. His name is Bashar al-Assad. Is he the one who destroyed Syria? Well, Syria was already suffering from an authoritarian regime since Assad's father seized power in the 1970s in a coup d'etat. When al-Assad took over as the new ruler of Syria in 2000, he continued his father's repressive regime. He instigated severe crackdowns on any political dissent, private or public. This led to the releasing of 600 political prisoners to ease tension, but unfortunately it didn't work as planned. By 2011, Assad authorized the release of a significant number of terrorist leaders from prison. These terrorists would soon after regroup to form ISIS. These created violent crackdowns on protesters, turned the Arab Spring movement into an armed rebellion by the Syrian opposition. As the civil war progressed, Assad continued arresting citizens and was personally implicated in the number of war crimes by the United Nations, including the imprisonment and killing of his own citizens. By 2015, about 200,000 political prisoners had been jailed for speaking out against the president himself and the regime. In the meantime, Assad's actions have forced 6.5 million residents out of their homes and 3 million out of their country, as well as decimating the economy and military. Bashar al-Assad is not only destroying Syria, but essentially helped facilitate the creation and rise of ISIS. Now, the president of Syria is al-Assad, obviously, but he's a Ba'athist, which is a nationalist ideology, and a member of the Alawite religion. The largest group in Syria are the Sunni Muslims, which make up around 74% of the Kurds, Turkomans, Circassians, and Palestinians. Sunni Islam sets the religious tone for Syria and provides the country's basic values. And it's Assad himself who rules over these religions. However, Assad doesn't really pay attention or treat the other religions equally. He treats the Alawites better and with more concerns since he's himself from the Alawite religion. The Alawites in Syria is one of the minority groups, but people from these religions happen to have a lot of power, either socially or economically, which means that their voices are more respected in a way, and people tend to listen to them because of how much power they have. Which is why they elected Bashar al-Assad, no matter the amount of population. Since the lowest population voted for al-Assad, the other groups and its population didn't really consider the election as being fair. During the Arab Spring movement, when many of the countries on North and Middle East were able to get rid of authoritarian leaders, groups in Syria wanted the same thing. They didn't really want to have an authoritarian leader or Bashar al-Assad to like lead the country. They didn't want that anymore. But it didn't work. And when Syria didn't get what it wanted, a civil war happened between the people who wanted the president, so Bashar al-Assad, in, and between them and between the people who didn't want him in power. So this created a civil war, and yeah, but the problem with that is that the people who wanted him out were not united, and many of these groups are fighting against the government. So in consequence, extremist Sunni Muslims broke from the Al-Qaeda network and began ISIS, or ISIL. ISIS controls the northern part of Syria and northwestern part of Iraq. So the thing is that the president, of course, he doesn't really want terrorists and ISIS in his country, but he doesn't really pay attention to them, or he doesn't try to overcome this problem because he's too busy trying to get rid of the people who want him out of the country. So all his attention is focused on these people who don't want him as president, and people who don't want him to rule the country, to have power. So yeah, so he's too busy focusing on them instead of focusing on ISIS. So this clearly proves that Syria doesn't have internal political control over its territory, over its country, sorry. Also, al-Assad uses his own country and his own population chemical weapons against the groups that desire to see him out and who doesn't want him to be in power. Syria was already known to have committed war crimes in the past because they used cluster bombs against civilians. So Syria was made to sign the Chemical Weapon Convention, and Syria was supposed to destroy all its chemical weapons, but they don't seem to have given all their chemical weapons because someone is still using those weapons in Syria, and no one really knows who that person is or who the group of people is. So external countries that are intervening are the United States, Turkey, and Western countries. Since Turkey invaded Syria, Syria asked the Russian troops to become allies with them. Both of these countries are using hard power to further their goal, no matter what the consequences and damage are. Now here's why Russia supports Syria. Russia supports the president Bashar al-Assad and want him in power, so they both bomb over the groups that want the president out of power. But since the president doesn't do anything about ISIS, and their terrorist attacks, such as the terrorist attacks that happened in Belgium and in France not long ago, the United States, Turkey, and Western countries, which are against ISIS, come in and fight against Syria and Russia in order to kill ISIS. But this means that the potential for a Russia/US accident is great. Now here's where it's getting tricky. Russia is bombing wrong places, which means that Russia is bombing the wrong groups of people. And this is because Russia is getting wrong and bad information from Syria. This leads to huge amount of Syrian immigrants that used to live in the north of Syria, which is where the Kurdish ethnic groups are, which also happens to be spread out over 5 countries. So in other words, they're bombing the largest groups without including his own country. Now the United States has provided small arms and ammunition and some of their supplies, but no heavy weapons such as anti-tanks or anti-aircraft weapons to Two Kurdish militias in Syria, hoping to launch a major offensive against ISIS. But the fear that the United States has in giving them weapons, small weapons, is that the Kurds might give their weapons to the other Kurds living in Turkey, which would put the United States on collisions with the Turkey and Syrian rebels. Normally, the could be liberals would consider Syria. No, sorry. Syria could be considered liberals if Syria cooperated with international organizations such as the United Nations or the Chemical Weapon Convention. Also, if Syria had elections, also if Syria had elections, sorry. Then the neoconservatism allows their leader, that doesn't seem to represent all the countries, to continue to rule other countries that are willing to get him out. Social construction is saying in refugees are portrayed by the media. So for them, there are good refugees and bad refugees. The good refugees are the ones who have highly trained skills and can contribute to the economy of the country. So engineers, doctors, scientists, like people who are very highly trained skills. Then bureaucracy, they don't really want anything to change because they're happy. They're happy and they're still receiving paychecks from Syria. So yeah, no, they don't want anything to change. They still want him to be in power because they feel very loyal to the president. So how does the conflict in Syria affect Switzerland? Well, because refugees are coming here, some of the refugees are asylum seekers. So asylum seekers are the people who say that they must stay in Switzerland, otherwise, if they go back to Syria, they will be killed. They're normally against Bashar al-Assad, which means that obviously if they go back, they will be known as the people who want him out. So they will most likely to be killed or to be put in jail. They're granted asylum seeker. So because if they went back, they have fear to be killed. Switzerland takes refugees and asylum seekers, but the difference between these two is that the refugees, at some point they have to go back. At some point they have to go back to their country, and asylum seekers don't, because they will be killed. That's their excuse. The excuse that if they go back they will be killed. So Switzerland can't really like get rid of them because yeah, they will be killed and tortured or put in jail. The Fragile State Index states that Syria is the 6th country in the very high alert, and the first one is Somalia. Syria scores 10 out of 10 in 5 of the 12 criteria of a fragile state. These 5 criteria are refugees and IDPs, group grievance, state legitimacy, external intervention, and security apparatus. I'm only going to talk about the 3 of the 5 criteria that make Syria a fragile state. So I'm going to talk about, for me, the most important ones. So it's refugees and IDPs, group grievance, and security apparatus. Refugees and IDPs is the pressure associated with population displacement. This strains public services and has the potential to pose a security threat. It includes pressure and measures related to displacement, refugee camps, IDP camps, diseases related to displacement, refugee per capita, IDP per capita, and absorption capacity. Then group grievance, it's when tensions and violence exist between groups. The state's ability to provide security is undermined, and fear and further violence may ensue. It includes pressures and measures related to discrimination ethnic values, communal violence, sectarian violence, and religious violence and powerlessness. And finally, security apparatus is the security apparatus should have a monopoly on the use of legitimate force. It includes pressures and measures related to internal conflict, small arms proliferation, riots and protests, fatalities from conflict, military coup, rebel activity, militancy, bombing, and political prisoners. These three criteria that I just stated completely relate to the situation that Syria is facing, such as like the political prisoners or the bombing, the violence, the religious violence between the different religions that they are in Syria. Um, Also, the refugees, the diseases related to displacement, and absorption capacity. So all of these things relate to what Syria is facing nowadays. So I hope you enjoy watching the video and that you learn a lot of things about Syria. Bye!